Okay. Welcome, everybody. I'm Dr. Emily Ritter, and I'm an assistant professor of political science at the University of California, Merced. And I'm the coordinator of online speaker series for the Peace Science Society. This is our third session of the online Peace Science Colloquium. This is an online series that meets every 2 weeks or so in order to present new and ongoing research on topics related to peace science, whether that's internal conflict or international conflict, and different forms of peace settlements and things like that. Today we have a presentation from Scott Wolford, who's an associate professor of political science at the University of Texas. He's going to be presenting a paper today that's entitled War-Winning Coalitions and Post-War Peace. It's our first international one of the semester, which I'm pretty excited about. And today we'll also have, we'll be hearing comments and discussion about this paper from Amy Yuen, who is an associate professor of political science at Middlebury College. Dinah Chiba, who is a lecturer at Essex University of Essex rather. And Michaela, who's an associate professor of political science at Berkeley. So the way this is usually structured is that we'll hear a presentation from Scott for the first 15 minutes, and then we'll open up the discussion to the discussants. And we'll run until right about 11:15 my time, which is, I guess, 1:15 everybody else's time.
6 p.m. my time.
Okay, fair enough. Okay. Scott, take it away.
All right, thank you. Let me make sure I nail down this screen sharing thing.
Okay.
How are we?
Looks great.
Okay, excellent. First, Emily, thanks for putting this together, and to the committee for choosing this paper. I'm pretty excited to present it. It's called War-Winning Coalitions and Post-War Peace, which emerged from some of the work I've recently done on interstate military coalitions. And it seeks to ask a pretty simple question. Simple, but one I think that is certainly worth finding out an answer to, which is, why do some war-winning coalitions collapse in war while others manage peace amongst the victors for years and even decades afterwards? Motivating this is a fact I uncovered when working on this question, which is that nearly half of all coalitions that have won interstate wars together have ended up turning against one another violently after the fact. This is running from about 1816 to the present. That's a pretty high number. It's a decent rate, and sometimes these former partners end up fighting before former belligerents do, right? And this is kind of what set me on this path to wondering why some of these coalitions can't keep it together after they win a war, because it seems that there are actually two elements of post-war peace. When we think about designing settlements at the end of wars, we've got a lot of work that looks at peace between former belligerents, which is an obvious place to look. But I'm going to argue today that we can also productively study peace between former coalition partners, right? We've seen some pretty wide variation in how long the winners of wars can keep things together, as it were. The winners of the First Balkan War lasted 71 days before they turned to one another in a pretty bloody conflict that presaged World War I. World War II, that settlement lasted about 5 years. The the Persian Gulf War settlement going on 25 years, but I guess it depends on what happens in Syria. So I think this variation is quite worth explaining. And I think that to do it, we need to build a theory of shared victory, right? And one that takes seriously the role of war in the international system, which is something that I think we're starting to do better in IR, where we think about war not just as an outcome to be explained, but a constitutive process of what we think of as international relations. Key to the story is this idea that war is both unpredictable and redistributive. So after a war, if countries have cooperated together to defeat an enemy, they are frequently left with distributions of territory, population, wealth, and power that they didn't really anticipate before the war began. You know, the example I use in the paper is World War II, which, you know, when it began in 1939, predicting that the Soviets would actually end up on the side of the Allies isn't obvious, that Stalin would end up occupying Manchuria and gutting its industrial capacity, not exactly predictable, or the U.S. defeating Japan without a massive amphibious operation. So war can move things around chaotically and unpredictably, and this creates what I call the problem of shared victory, right? So where the winners of a war, have a coalition war, I should say, are then in a position of bargaining over two things. One is the division of the new status quo. Who controls what territory? Who is going to govern newly reconstituted or destroyed states? And who is going to defend the status quo, right? So whose responsibility is it to protect the new settlement from revisionist challenges? If they're going to achieve this, and if the winners are to stay at peace, I argue that it requires a set of multilaterally credible commitments. Right? So whether this is 2 countries that win a war together or 12, the thing I'm looking for and the thing I'm interested in is when they can all manage to share in their victory peacefully. And I think, you know, it's worth noting that this is not just a story about the world wars, right? The Balkan War, the first Balkan War, is an interesting example, but I've got a sample of 26 wars that were won by coalitions in the past, you know, 2 centuries. And we see a lot of variation in the size of the coalition and the types of states involved. So I think we've got an interesting problem here, but not a lot of answers to it just yet. So this is it's kind of the key insight of the theory, I think, which is that war creates a unique problem that single victors don't face. And so the question is, when can states make and maintain these multilaterally credible commitments? At the heart of the theory is, well, to be perfectly redundant, is a claim that coalition members remain at peace when commitments to that new peace settlement, that is, who gets what territory, who governs what territory, who has control over the distribution of prestige, etc., when those commitments can remain credible, when no member of the coalition after the war has an incentive to try to renegotiate its share of the benefits, right? You know, after the Second World War, we actually see war breakout amongst the former victors over the governance of Korea, right? So these are specific terms that come out of the war, specific features of the settlement that can produce conflict if the commitments to them aren't credible or able to be peacefully renegotiated. Another good example that I probably should have put in the paper is the war between Soviet Russia and Poland after World War I, right, which is conflict over the border that was established between the two as a result of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, right, near the end of the war. But in building the theory, I tried to think really hard about what war itself could do, right, what the act of winning a war actually does, what kind of bargaining problems that creates. And I think that at least my first 2 hypotheses, the first 2 implications, follow from this idea that war itself can change political conditions, right? It can change the cost of and ease with which countries can try to renegotiate these new settlements. And so it's not just that all countries face particular changing conditions, it's that war does specific things, and it does specific things to coalition partners. One is, well, my first hypothesis that comes out of this is really the core of the classical theory of coalitional politics, right? It's based in Riker's size principle, which is the simple idea that larger coalitions are at a greater risk of war. That is, the larger the coalition, the more likely are any 2 of its members to fall into war after winning their first war than smaller coalitions. The idea here is that it's actually costlier to produce a victory than it is to share and defend it. And so this idea that overlarge coalitions tend to shed members isn't new, but the idea that one might launch a war to stave off losing out in the post-war settlement at least is in a quantitative sense, which I'll look at later in the paper. So in the first case, we just simply have the size principle prediction, which will be hypothesis 1. Next, One other thing that war might change is the logic that underpins the alliance commitments with which states entered the war. You know, many times when states form alliances, they do so with states that share similar interests, but they're also perhaps unlikely to try to tether reliable states to their own foreign policy. You want to tether people that might be unreliable partners, right? Especially if cooperation between you is already difficult. And it seems possible that if two countries sign an alliance that is targeted at another state, they defeat that state in a war. That war itself, the act of victory, has kind of taken restraints off of trying to renegotiate whatever deals exist between the two once the war ends. And so hypothesis 2 suggests that the more allies you have in the coalition, that is, the larger proportion of the coalition that begins tethered to one another by alliance contracts, is going to be at a greater risk of post-victory collapse than those that came in without alliances. It's a bit counterintuitive, but I think because we typically think of alliances as, you know, assisting with general deterrence, with you know, with the facilitation of trade, a lot of kind of good outcomes. But here, the logic of the alliance may actually be changed by the fact that the war is now over and a common enemy defeated. Finally, it wouldn't be a paper that mentions the credibility of commitments if we didn't think about shifting power after the war, right? So the idea here is that countries can win a war, and then they have to demobilize. They have to remove troops from contested territory. They have to attempt to reintegrate soldiers into sometimes shattered economies, and some of them will recover more quickly than others. And the idea here is that when capabilities, military capabilities especially, start to shift over time, then those coalitions that can weather these shifts peacefully, right? They can either smooth them out or they can negotiate peacefully to reflect changing realities of power amongst the members, are going to be more peaceful than those that can't. And I actually link this to the presence of a great power in the coalition. Not any particular number of great powers, but just having one at all. In the appendix of the paper, I have kind of a little toy formal model of this idea of multilateral commitments. And the idea that comes out of it is that if you have at least one great power in a coalition, it is able to back up declining states against, you know, weaker rising states inside the coalition and help facilitate peaceful renegotiation. And great powers themselves are also less vulnerable to the same shocks to capabilities or temporary reversals that would otherwise tempt smaller states with weaker absolute capabilities into war. So we kind of have the idea that a great power member of the coalition can serve as an anchor that helps to prevent shifting power within the coalition from being so dangerous, right? And this should look different than great powers involved in just any random collection of states because of that specific bargaining problem that war-winning coalitions face, which is they all have an agreement, they all have an incentive to work together to preserve this settlement, but disagreements over how to share it, distribute it, and defend it can become contentious after the war. So I kind of, I'll leave it with these three hypotheses before we talk about the empirics. And I think, yes, that is in fact a research design slide, which is good. The data that I present have 26 war-winning coalitions since 1815. Now to get this, I collected the victors of 25 wars in the COW data, the correlates of war data, and then added some data on the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Since most of our data that IR scholars use begins in 1815, it didn't seem like it would be terribly difficult, but my long-suffering RA who had to look for some casualty statistics in the original Russian might disagree with that claim. But
about 3 minutes, Scott.
Okay. Oh, crap. All right. In these data, we have about 46%, nearly half of the coalitions falling into war with one another. And that really is a threshold of 2 states falling into war. Theoretical variables are not going to be shocking. We have the logged size of the coalition, how densely they're allied, the coalition is allied the first day of the war, and great power participation. There's some control variables that are linked to both either some combination of those and our outcome, which is the duration of peace, that I can talk about in the Q&A. And I use a Cox proportional hazards model, an event history model that turns out, thankfully, to not need adjustments for non-proportional hazards. So it's a fairly simple model. I don't have a ton of panels, but I do have a lot of analysis time. And we can, I think, get right to, first, here are some descriptive statistics if you want to see what we're looking at in terms of the coalition size. Most are small, but a good chunk, over half, are bigger than 2, which is not so bad. We won't worry about the percent of allied pairs in the coalition, but we'll just get to an abbreviated statistical table, right? So these are the results that are in the main paper if people want to see it, but I've just got some selected controls and the theoretical variables. They're hazard coefficients. They're not odds they're not ratios. So these are just positive, negative. Positive means you go to war sooner after the war. Negative means that you last a bit longer. And broadly, we see what the theory expects, right? Larger coalitions shed members violently, more quickly than small coalitions, even controlling for the opportunity of size. Coalitions with a lot of allies tend to fall apart violently as well, but those anchored against a great power seem to maintain peace longer than those that are just purely of minor and middle powers. Here are some graphics that aren't going to add too much, but they do look pretty, so we do have them here to show you the effect of 2, 4, and 6 member coalitions. Those hazard rates obviously go up. Same thing for quarter, 3/4, and fully allied coalitions, where the allied coalitions are the ones that tend to break apart. We also have nothing on great powers, which is good given the time constraint. So what do I think I've shown, right? Is that post-war peace, which we care about, and which has a lot to do with the stability of international order and everything that flows from that, like the everyday politics of the international system, requires that we understand peace between victors and vanquished, but also peace amongst the victors, right? I think that I hope that I've identified a useful and unique bargaining problem that these actors face, and that we can learn more in general from this about how to build coalitions effectively, their role in world order, and as I said at the beginning, the role of war itself and what it does for subsequent interactions in international relations. And with that, I look forward to your comments.
All right. Thank you, Scott. And I'd like to remind anybody who is watching, if you'd like to take a closer look at this paper, it's posted on the Peace Science Online Colloquia website, which is on a tab of the Peace Science more general website. And with that, I would like to open up any kinds of questions or comments or criticisms from our panelists. Amy?
Oh.
Sorry. You need to put your hand in the middle of the screen for me to be able to see you.
Oh, wait. I read through the whole paper, of course, and thought that this was a very fascinating question. It's one that I think needs to be asked, and to look at coalition behavior. I like the perspective that you're bringing to our understanding of peace, especially in a post-war context, is not just being between belligerents, but amongst allies as well. But I had a big question about what you're testing. So your argument relies very heavily on this idea that there is, that the outcome of the war is creating a commitment problem, right, and causing motivations for renegotiation. But you don't test that, right? So your cases are limited to winning coalitions. Mm-hmm. And it seems like a natural thing to me to open that up to, well, compared to what? So if there's a larger pie to be distributed after a war, right, because you have won this war, mm-hmm. You're that's sort of the thing that you're saying is the moving part, but you're only looking at winning coalitions. So I was wondering if it would be useful to expand it out to look at coalitions that in stalemate, because they presumably don't have a larger pie, to see if your ideas bear out, in which case it would it would actually be a more direct test of your theory as it's presented in the paper.
Awesome, thank you. And I'm waiting to respond, right, until we get a few more.
Yeah, unless
Okay.
you feel like there's
Oh, no.
you need to get started. Okay, Dinah.
Okay, yeah, I actually felt the opposite to what Amy just said. I think it's great that you focus on the set of samples that you analyze. I think I really like your emphasis on how focusing on war-winning coalition is a better way of testing the implications of bargaining model, because we are not comparing apples and oranges. We can focus on a small number of samples that are actually comparable. So that was my take on the point that was just made. My comments I prepared are more about the empirics.
Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't completely sold on your usage of the size and the opportunity variables. Right, so for a few reasons. First, the opportunity variable is a deterministic function of the size variable, right? That makes it impossible for you to make a competitive aesthetics. You can't change the value of the opportunity holding constant the size, or vice versa. You can't change the value of the size holding constant opportunity, right? So since they are not linear functions, mathematically you can include them both, but including these two terms in a model is tantamount to including a higher order term in a model, which is a very way of testing a nonlinear relationship. But I don't think it gets you what you want, right? You can't really control for opportunity by using the opportunity variable that you created. So I think I don't have a concrete suggestion to address that point, but I mean, naturally you can do one of two things, right? You can have an alternative measure of the size variable that is not a deterministic function of opportunity, or you can have an alternative measure of opportunity. And I think the size variable, there might be something that you can do with the size variable.
Mm-hmm.
So large size is not equivalent, is not equal to oversize that your theory is talking about, right? Large coalition might be what's actually necessary to defeat the enemy, right? So what you want to capture is oversized coalition that is actually bigger than necessary. I mean, as I said, I don't have a solution to this problem, right. But there might be something that you can do to do with that. To leave the size variable as a measure of opportunity and try to have something else to capture oversize. That makes sense.
Okay.
So I have another point on the empirics is about the measure power variable.
Mm-hmm.
So in the appendix, in the game theory game theoretic model that you have, what really matters in the model is the relative size of this shock variable S relative to A and B, right? Lowercase a and lowercase b, the size of the military for side A and side B. So I can see that if either A, if A is a major power, it makes it more difficult for S, for there to be a preventive war unless S is really, really big.
Mm-hmm.
But if both A and B are from major powers, then S doesn't have to be really large to satisfy the inequality condition. Right? So I don't think having a dummy variable that coded 1 if there is one major power is a good proxy of the theoretical concept that you're trying to measure. So I think you could do more with the material that you already have. So I think one way to address this would be to construct a summary measure of the inequality of powers or of relative powers of all the possible k-ads within coalition, and have, I don't know, mean or median or the minimum as the summary measure.
Okay.
Right. So you can construct possible k-ads and calculate bilateral ratio of powers, and larger the discrepancy between the powers, then the more difficult it is to satisfy the inequality condition. S has to be really large, right? I also have more minor comments on more even more minor details of the empirics, but I can actually I think I can wait farther.
Okay.
Okay, Michaela.
So I actually had a comment that was related to Amy's, and then maybe also something related that Dinah said that it made me think of something that I hadn't actually considered before. So related to Amy's comment is I also was wondering about sort of the framing of the theoretical argument, and if you could make that a little bit more compelling. Although I have read this paper before, and I think it's already looking really great. I remember 2 years ago, and it's come a long way. So the underlying problem that you're suggesting is leading to war is a commitment problem, and that different war-winning coalitions are better or worse at overcoming the commitment problem. And so the question is, what exactly is causing this commitment problem, and is it directly the result of the war, right? So, or is there something, commitment problem is about shifts in power, right? So is this an argument that as the result of a war-ending deal, there will be shifts in power, or are there shifts in power that might be happening that are unrelated to it? So I was kind of wondering about it, and I wonder if you could, I realized there's an argument later in the paper that you can't look at if there are shifts in power in the aftermath of war, because if they are leading to war, then the war occurs before the shift, right? So it's kind of, so there would be a selection going on, but I was wondering if you could just make a more compelling theoretical argument for why we should expect these shifts in power in the aftermath of war, and then also maybe just a case, maybe a discussion of a case or so that shows that there were concerns about how this deal is shifting power, right? So it's kind of, I guess, a set of 3 points. One is the commitment problem really the result of war that emerges because the war is shifting, or the outcome of the war shifting power? How can you sort of show this a little bit? And I guess it's only 2 points, not 3. So that was, I think, a more general point. And then just something before I forget that Dinah said, right? This is this tricky problem you have with that you're interested in the oversized coalition, but it could just be opportunity because there are more members who could more of them fight. So I don't know how to get around that either, but when Dinah was just commenting about it, I was wondering if it was the case that actually, so you actually look at whether the war-ending deal fails the first time, right, if there's a war.
Right.
So if it's opportunity, right, we might actually expect more wars among the members of the coalition. And so maybe if we're not actually seeing more wars, right, that would give you, or like more wars between different dyads, that would give you some support that that's not what is going on, right, that it's not purely opportunity. So I don't know if that actually makes sense, because I haven't really thought it through. It was just when Dinah was talking, but before I forget.
Gotcha.
And Amy has a two-finger on that. I'm sorry, Michaela.
I was just going to say I have some other comments too, but I will wait, obviously.
Okay, let's get Amy on her two-finger, and then let Scott have a moment, and then we'll come back.
So I was thinking the same thing, Michaela, when you just mentioned this idea about how many wars the coalition has. I had a comment here about when you're talking about the post-World War situation and looking at Korea as the example in which the coalition members end up fighting. And I was thinking, well, they fought over one issue, one part of the bargain, but they didn't, like Germany and Berlin were huge issues between them that they never really technically resolved with an agreement. They just went with the status quo, but they never had a hot war over it. And so I know that your definition of when the coalition fights has to be the way it is. I buy that. I think it's a good cutoff. It's clear. But Michaela's point, I think, actually would bring that into it a little bit more, so you could use it in both ways to try and think about how many members fight, maybe how many opportunities they have to fight, that kind of thing. So I think that's neat. And also, I was going to say I had the same reaction that she did in terms of where the power shifts are happening, and I listed in my response that I saw 3 different places. One is with the outcome of the war, so the victory is creating this issue. One is you talk about shocks and shocks to the system that create these potentials potentials for renegotiation, and then the long-term shifts in power, which is the one that you use to justify the preventive war scenario, right? So I feel like you could get more on the other two if you actually did measure it and try to incorporate it some way into the empirical model, even though the scenario of preventive war might make it so that there's some funkiness, like you'd miss a couple of episodes.
Awesome.
Scott, you want to take a few minutes?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to work backwards, at least from, actually I'm just going to do, Amy, I'll do yours at once. I'll go Amy, Dinah, Michaela. The thing with the Korean War I think is interesting, and I really struggled with how to think about, what that meant for the World War II settlement. I'd given some thought to splitting World War II up by theater, and I came down against it because the Soviets are so important to both. And there were tremendous fears that if the U.S. gets too bogged down in Korea, then the Soviets try something in Europe, right, at the same time. And so the people involved viewed them as so tied together that I haven't been able to convince myself to break it apart yet. If I do, it's kind of interesting. When that, to say that we have the Pacific settlement break down pretty quickly, but the European settlement looks a bit different. So I'll think more about it, right? But I think that also comes into the thing of whether I would bring in stalemates, right? And again, this is another one that I find it's harder for me to tell myself a story yet. And Korea is a really good one, right? So because that one ended where nothing changed, right? Like the status quo was restored even though it took 3 years. On the other hand, right, that means that the first coalition to break down is the Communist coalition, right, with the Sino-Soviet border war. So you still get like 16 years of peace on one side. I'll dig into it a little more and see what happens. Like having 26 panels, or 26 subjects, I should say. Like I need to look for as many as I can get. But to the extent that kind of helps with not only sample size, but figuring out what I'm comparing this sample to, I think that's a really good idea. Let's see. On Dinah stuff, yeah, I've yet to be terribly satisfied with how I've controlled for the opportunity thing. And now I really don't like the opportunity variable as I have it, right? So I'll try to figure something more about that. On the distinction between large and oversized, I'll have to think some more about it, because when I think of oversized, I tend to mean oversized in terms of sharing stuff after, as opposed to too big, unnecessarily large to win. But there's still got to be a better way to kind of get at the distinction between just take draw a few states out of a bin and see how long it takes any of them to fight. You draw more out, you're certainly going to get it. Let's see, the issue with the theoretical model, I'll look a little more closely. I had satisfied myself that would work, that the claim would work, but I'll go back and look, right, just to make sure that if I move those two things, move those two capabilities at once to see what happens. I'm certainly going to check and make sure. But I do like the idea of this kind of, I guess, kind of the average disparity of power, right, amongst the members. I think that would be useful in a lot of ways anyway, right? So that's very cool. And that's also quite easy to do. And then to Michaela's point, you hit on something that, like, I put this paper away for a week, and then I was reading through it, and I thought something doesn't feel right, and you hit on exactly what it is, right? I've actually got two sources of changing incentives or changing commitments involved, and I don't make a good distinction between them in the paper, right? In terms of shifts in the commitment to the settlement caused by the war, or the commitment to cooperation, is certainly meant to be there, but I don't know that it really did come out very well. And then the problem of shifts following the war, cases would be really good. And I've got some to sit on. I'm sitting on a few that I think I can throw in there, so it's good to know that that would help. In fact, I think Korea is actually a really interesting case, right? Because a lot of the motive for the invasion in 1950 is that the North doesn't think itself very viable, and the Soviets don't think they are either. So they basically say, "Fine, go ahead and try to capture the South while you can." I think that would be a really good one. So I'm gonna do exactly that. And then the thing about looking for follow-on wars, I'll think more about that. Like there's something there, and if I can think hard, if I can come up with something good about what that represents without kind of favoring coalitions that are just naturally big, I think I can get at that. But yeah, these are great so far. Thanks.
I'm going to assert my prerogative as the moderator and make a comment really fast and then open it back up. So in a broader sense, this isn't a theoretical point so much. I mean, everything's a theoretical point, really. But as I was reading, I feel like you can make a stronger case right from the beginning as to why the post-war peace between coalition members is a more dangerous, or it's more fraught with peril than peace between two states that didn't fight together, right? So if we're talking about Russia and the United States, or the Soviet Union and the United States, or whatever, and if they hadn't fought in a coalition together, and they also hadn't just ended a war, right? What would they be more or less likely to fight, right? What about winning a war together makes them more likely to fight together than we would see in a baseline?
Right.
You get to it on page 6, and it's in a paragraph. And I feel like it's a lot, I think it's really important for selling the contribution. You're looking at a type of peace that people don't really look at, and I think that's really important. It's a weird commitment problem that's different from the commitment problems we think about, right? And I think that you should play that up a lot more right at the beginning.
Okay.
What you're doing is doing a lot of the same spiel from your book about why we should study coalitions and not why we should study this particular dependent variable, which is a really unique one.
I don't have much to respond with, but to say yes, I think that's a very good idea.
Good, I think it's a good idea. Michaela. Oh, Michaela's muted.
Oh, yes, I'm.
Oh, muted again. There. Hit it one more time. Okay.
I love the internet.
Right there.
Is it now? Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, we can hear you. No problem.
I hit it too fast, I think. So I have like 2 comments on the alliances one. Variable one is a more conceptual question. The other one is a measure question.
Okay.
So I like the argument that you make about how alliances, I think it's also, I think previously that wasn't the argument, right? Like you actually had it more as a surprising finding. And I think it makes sense to say this is actually maybe not that surprising that alliances are not actually contributing to post-war peace because they're formed, when the allies think that they have some differences in interest. So the interesting thing to me, though, is the allies are forming those because they think they have some difference in interest, and the alliance is supposed to overcome that. But apparently, it's not doing that effectively, right? So I feel like you could emphasize that a little bit more. Okay. But it then also led me to wonder. Is it just maybe sort of like you say, it's papering over the differences during the war, but then they emerge later? So that to me led to the question is, are these alliances that are active at the beginning of the war lasting after the war, or are they ending before? So at the time these states are fighting, are they still allied or not? Right? Or it's like, has the alliance failed already before that? So that just seemed like to me interesting to make sort of just to have a better understanding what the alliance going on. And then related to the measure, this is actually kind of a similar point, is that so you measure the percentage of states that are dyads that are allied within the coalition. Mm-hmm. So if you have 66%, 2/3 allied, and you observe a war, it's still possible that war was not between the ones that had been allied. Right? So are you actually accounting for that? Or did you make sure to check that that's not what's going on here? Right. Those were just 2 quick points.
Actually, I have quick responses to these, if that's okay. Yeah. On the last one, I compared the average. So I looked at the kind of uncollapsed dyadic data. And so the average survival time at peace for the allied pairs is lower than the non-allied pairs. So there's at least that kind of just face, comparison out there that seems to work with it. They're going to war sooner, which it's not perfect, right? And frankly, it's also only 26 subjects, so I can dig into that a little more thoroughly. And as for whether they're surviving the war or not, I hadn't thought of that at all, but that's really interesting. Because especially if they're dying during the war, that's really indicative of a problem, right? Maybe not specifically the one I'm looking at. Well, no, I don't know. I'll look into that more. I think that could be a really cool kind of additional implication of the theory. So, excellent.
Dinah?
I was wondering about what you did with state death. So there are a few cases where a coalition, one or more of former coalition members exited the state system. Mm-hmm. Did you treat these observations as right-censored, or?
Let's see. No, this is a good question. I've just got to find I made a note about how I did this. It was surprising. So it's really an issue with the Franco-Prussian War, when some of these states actually just become Germany. Right. Right. Yeah. So I've done one where I just dropped the Franco-Prussian War. Okay. There are others where was it? That's actually the biggest one, but I've dropped it. There were a couple others, and my solution was just to drop that observation individually, and then
I see.
But the Franco-Prussian War is an interesting case, right? Because it's kind of like if you win a war together and then you become a country, that's a pretty serious level of cooperation. But I'm not sure it's the one I'm talking about. Right. Exactly. But that a very effective bargain, I suppose. But yeah, I think I could make it clearer. Right, that's probably worth not just having in a footnote. It's probably worth.
Yeah, I guess because you can just treat them as right-censored at the point of unification of Germany, or with other cases that involve countries like Czechoslovakia or Yugoslavia, you can treat them as censored at that point. Even though it's possible that the rest of the members can still have war after they exit the system, but I think that could be one way to do a stress check.
Amy on a 2-finger, and then Michaela.
I was just thinking about that, though. It seems to me, so when you bring up the Franco-Prussian War and the unification of the German states, that is the ultimate bargain, is it not?
Yeah.
So would you want to right-censor them, or would you want to say, by the way, this one survived, and it survives until basically they're defeated in a coalition that is a losing coalition, right? It's
right. Yeah, I mean, my instinct is to say yes, that's a really effective winning coalition, right?
It's not state death; it's state life. It's sort of the other side of the coin, right? So that seems like you would actually lose some information there.
Yeah, point taken. I'll happily keep that in.
Michaela.
So there's something that this is like maybe doesn't fall quite exactly within like the sort of providing comments that are within the paper. But one thing that I kept thinking about when I read the paper is like, what about the terms of peace, right? That this war, this winning war coalition is actually getting for itself. So I realize your focus is on actually the coalition and the composition of the coalition, but it seems that the terms of peace that emerge from war would be interesting too, because they would speak to this potential commitment problem, right? And in particular, maybe if the terms of peace, sort of, I don't know, I'd have to think through it more, but how they distribute the territory or any other spoils, how specific it is, whether it sets up certain institutions, like, Congress of Vienna or something like that. Like, what if there's some way, like, if this peace treaty or this peace deal itself sort of affects whether a commitment problem will later on occur or not. And I also think that would nicely parallel the literature, like for instance, Amy and Suzanne Werner's work, right? Which there, between belligerents, we're often interested in what actually the terms of the agreement was, or also Paige Fortna. And this is kind of, you're setting it up as a parallel to that, and here's a different set of actors we should be worried about. And so it would be nice to hear more about the peace terms. And I realize that's maybe a separate paper or something, but it did make me think about it quite a bit.
I'll wait to respond if that's a two-finger from Amy.
Yeah, but I was thinking similarly, and this has a little bit to do, I think, with Michaela's earlier comment about timing and all of that, but knowing what the prior bargain looks like, right? You refer to it a lot, you say there's these prior commitments, and I kept reading and thinking, okay, what does that look like? And I think a little bit about what Michaela's saying is, okay, here's what does a settlement look like? What do the terms of peace look like? I want to know, in addition to that, what did the agreement look like that they're supposedly renegotiating? Right? What did you expect going into the war? So what did the U.S. and Britain and France and the Soviet Union expect? What did they agree to as they came together to fight the Nazis and whatnot? And then why is it different, or why is that changing afterwards? Just even in examples would be really helpful to wrap my mind around that.
I would definitely agree with that. It's something that you've black boxed a lot in your previous work on coalitions, which is basically they're exchanging something, they're giving something up, right? They are just, someone's making an offer of what they're going to ask in terms of policy, how they're going to split the policy, what they're going to do with the pie afterward, right? And that commitment is what you're expecting when they start fighting together. And so obviously they're changing that, and I was thinking that too while I was reading. So just yes to what Amy said. You want to respond?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think I'm happy to do that. Right. I struggled when I wrote this draft of how much kind of color and examples to have. So I'm happy to hear that I can put this stuff in productively. Right. I didn't want it to be wasteful. But to get to so this all stems from Michaela's point about the terms of peace, which I think is a very good question, and I'll be happy. Well, I'm happy to say I've got an RA coding some of that stuff right now. So, the idea for this paper was kind of assume you've got the average war and then see what differences in coalition choice do. But then I was thinking about another paper that looks at basically the average coalition and then what the different ways the war ends and different types of settlements actually do, right? So we've looked at, kind of the distribution of deaths and casualties, like the distribution of costs of the war, whether countries gain or lose territory, like relative to their pre-war state, even amongst the victors. We've got another was whether the war produced buffer states as well. I don't know how many of those we're going to get, but I think it'd be a pretty, right? So I have this sense that, we have this, Tanisha Fazal's work says that buffer states tend to die a lot, but my suspicion is that they're really good at keeping the peace when they're alive. And I think that this might be an interesting way to get at that. So I guess I would have a question, though, is whether you think it would be important to have some of that stuff in this paper, or if I can productively keep them separate.
So I guess I would say that, I did wonder, Can you? Oh, you can.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, yeah.
So what confuses me is the little microphone still has the, the thing crossed through it, so I'm like not sure if I'm muted or not. I guess
You
it
can
turns
see
a
it in
different
your
color.
little window, like at the bottom. You can tell when it's on and off.
Yeah, so sorry. So my sense was, so I did wonder about it. For me, this wasn't a deal breaker. Like, I didn't read the paper and thought this is clearly incomplete because of that. I do think that you might acknowledge it and sort of, I don't know, refer to this as like maybe especially in the conclusion or something.
Okay.
That this is so I do think it would increase the value of the paper, but I don't think this is not a paper that can stand on its own without that discussion.
Okay.
I do think that you might acknowledge it.
Okay. Can do that.
Amy.
Okay, so I had one other point here that I was thinking about, but it's probably another paper instead of part of this one, but you tell me what you think. What if the coalition loses? So part of your theory, there are, I see why you limit your analysis and your theory to this, but there are some implicit assumptions that you're making about what happens when a coalition loses. And I think, one, that would be really interesting, and two, maybe just a mention so that you can say, well, they're not going to have the same kind of commitment problem, so we shouldn't see the same behavior.
Okay. Even if it is a separate paper, like calling it The Politics of Defeat, that's a pretty cool title. At least. I'll make that distinction. That's a good idea.
Michaela. There we go.
Okay, so I just had like something that I was wondering about. It's actually two questions, although like separate, but they made both of them, I thought, at the same time. So how long on average until the war between those former coalition partners? Right? Because if the war occurs more quickly after the initial war they won together, then I think it's more obvious that it would be a result of the previous war, rather than something completely unrelated, right? So I was wondering about like what's the average duration until they actually get to war, and what the range is. And then also the other thing, and I don't know that I have a sense of whether this is a problem or not. I actually not clear to me that it would be, but I was wondering if there are multiple of these war-winning coalitions who are failing through the same war eventually, right? So that I don't know, like World War II, of course that one, since it involves so many countries, is an easy one, might be ending the spells of peace for a variety of them. So I'm not sure this is a problem or not, but I would like you to sort of like think about maybe if it is a problem.
On the second one, it's actually, I worried about that initially, but I don't think there's any one war that ends multiple winning coalitions, I think. 2050. Just eyeballing it here. Oh, wait. World War II, it looks like World War II might be the culprit here. No, actually it's not. No, so it's close, right? World War II comes close to ending the World War I settlement and the War of Italian Unification. But based on who's actually doing the fighting, the World War I settlement breaks down in 38, and Italian unification not till 39. Still, that's close, right? I'm going to make a note on that one. And you're also right. There's kind of a notable absence of talking about how long these coalitions last on average. Which I can calculate. But I think that, so I've gotten some comments on this before, and I haven't figured out the right way to think about it, because my initial thought is, well, I take a pretty kind of broad view of how countries order their relations, right? And they could fight over something that is not a part of the initial settlement, but it's kind of, I don't know how to distinguish those two. Like, we fight over our border, and we never changed it at the end of winning a war. I honestly don't know, right? Like, how to think about that. But then, you know, on the other side of it, what I struggle with is, like, at what point, if I say, well, it's so long that it can't be about the same issues, like, at what point am I penalizing really stable settlements, right? So I think that you're right, that there has to be, it's possible that I've got kind of maybe, I don't know, false breakdowns if they start fighting over something that was unrelated. But I'll have to try to figure out a better way to distinguish the two. At a minimum, I can promise I'll keep thinking about it, because I'm not sure what the optimal or what the best solution for that is just yet. But I think, yeah, your point's well taken. Like, there's a chance that something is going to get missed in there. I'll work on it.
Hi, Connor. It's okay.
Might be his first appearance on YouTube.
Right?
When he's
Definitely
famous,
working from home.
when he's
It's an
famous,
in-service day.
when he's famous, they'll find this. Right? Somebody will dig back. This was actually his first appearance on the internet.
More thoughts or questions that Scott might have?
I had one small thing, if that's okay.
Sure.
Scott,
Mm-hmm.
I assume you're using cow definition of war, right? Because you're using the data set.
Yeah.
Okay. And maybe just a really small thing, telling us how your source data coded the war outcomes, because I wasn't familiar with the rules of how they make those designations of victory and all that stuff. I mean, these are the little tiny things, but I think they would help clarify when you're reading that you're sitting there going, wait, what does he mean by victory?
Right.
So those are two little small things. Also, I think it's a really interesting project.
Well, thank you. Quite happy to hear that. I mean, it has been really fun, right, to work on. And I'm sure, well, I also learned, I have a sense of why Cal never bothered to code stuff with the Napoleonic Wars, because it's a mess, right? Like, let's start in 1816. That makes a lot of sense. But yeah, it has been quite a bit of fun, and this is a lot of great feedback. So,
can I ask just a thought question? So, do these what happens when do these coalitions break apart without war, and what does that look like?
I have no idea. And so, you know, like, and in the initial iterations of this, I tried to think. So, I had a paper that made claims about coalitions that stay together after war, and it leads to balancing, you know, threats of that. And so I figured I needed to test this. And initially I was thinking, well, whether they stay together, war is just the worst, right? The costliest way they could break apart. But you could imagine that alliances being torn asunder, right? You know, just smaller breaches in diplomatic relations would do it. But I don't know what they would look like kind of temporally, right? Like, across this whole time span, right? Like, you could imagine that they would look, that when coalitions break apart, it could look quite a bit different depending on the historical era. But war was the one that I knew that was like the lowest common denominator, right? You know, you mentioned the German settlement, right, at the end of World War II. I mean, there was a settlement, it was reached, and it was contentious a lot, right? But it basically stayed in place, right, through a couple of big crises and whatnot. So if it's not war, I don't know, you know, I don't know what's as consistent across the historical eras, right? But I think it's something I struggled with, but I haven't come up with anything better yet than war. But of course, it's also odd, right, to say that the World War II settlement is, I mean, if not for the Korean War, that settlement looks pretty durable, which most people say, well, it's the Cold War. It was, right, it wasn't, but, you know.
Well, I mean, it does eventually fall apart with state death, right? Soviet Union.
Yeah, that's right.
Falls out, and that's pretty significant, right?
That's right. So,
but there are a couple of points in the paper where I mean, I didn't get to read a lot of it closely, but where you talk about the reasons for breakdown in cooperation, and I think Amy's right. The breakdown in cooperation doesn't always mean that you fight each other, right? And I think that there are multitudes of reasons why you wouldn't want to fight each other just because cooperation breaks down. So it'd be nice to kind of clarify what it is that you're actually predicting. You know what I mean? So like what it is about the concept that differs and why you're thinking of it in one way. Because there's a lot of things that you, right, like Riker-Sykes principle doesn't predict that you would fight each other. It predicts that you just would not be able to cooperate. Right? So I think that this is a worthy distinction for at least thinking about like what it is that why we would expect large coalitions to actually like shoot at each other.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point. You know, earlier versions of this paper had tried to say they could break down for many reasons. I'm just going to look at one, and then I'd kind of drill down on just focusing on the war angle and post-war peace. But I can still talk about that, right? So, you know, one way to look at, say, the World War I settlement is that cooperation breaks down because the U.S. doesn't join the League of Nations, forces Britain and France into paying their debts, which forces them to lean on the Germans for reparations, even as the U.S. is demanding that they, forgive some of this debt. Where you could say that settlement ended right then, but instead I have it ending with the Italian invasion of, is it Italy? Or it might be, I don't remember. Anyway, it ends in the late 30s, technically, right, with war. I think that's a distinction I could acknowledge, I think, a little more clearly.
It's fine-tuning.
Michaela.
Just sort of not actually related to what you were saying, but just sort of two comments and then maybe a question. Sort of the first two were more presentational. When I read about the size hypothesis, right, that oversized coalitions have more problems, I guess, credibly committing, I wasn't entirely clear why that's the case. I mean, you write on page 8, it's because each member's individual contribution to defending the new status quo is relatively more valuable, I guess, when it's small. But so to me, that wasn't immediately obvious what was going on there, so I think some explanation would be helpful. A second one, and this goes back to a point Dinah made earlier about the great powers, right? I think, like probably a lot of people when they read this first wonder, well, okay, so if there's one great power, I understand your argument, but what if there's two of them, right? But then also more important, if there's one great power and multiple minor powers, right, there could be shifts among the minor powers. And you actually, I think, deal with that quite well because you argue, well, the great power can actively manage the conflict between the minor ones. But I kind of would have liked to have maybe an example or something of that just to hit that point home, that this is, that it shouldn't be a problem, even if there are multiple minor powers. And then the third thing that I was just thinking about while we're talking, which I'm sure that, I mean, I think I know the reason why it's not in there, but you do wonder then about the composition of the regime composition of the war-winning coalitions, right? Sort of, and their homogeneity. What if a coalition is all democracy, right, versus mixed? And then, of course, the tricky thing is, like, at what point is it then just the characteristics of the countries individually that is affecting whether they're fighting versus something about the coalition? But I just wonder if you had thought about because that seems to be another characteristic of a coalition, right? It's like they're homogeneity. And yes, you do look at preference, sort of whether they have preferences in common. I think the S-score or something. I just was wondering if you had thought about that. Democracies may be better able to manage their coalitions.
That's it's a good question, and I used to have, so in a previous version of this paper, I had a measure that was basically the variance in the polity scores amongst the coalition, kind of get at the spread of it, and that was actually my measure of preference diversity, right? Kind of relying on the idea that if you look at most of this historical period, it's it's, you know, democracies and authoritarian states kind of lining up fairly often, right? On, like, that's the big kind of global divide a lot of times.
I'd be surprised if they correlate, though. Do they correlate?
You mean with the
that
stability?
spread versus preference diversity?
I mean, that was my argument, was that was a proxy for preference diversity, right?
Right, I know, but are they practically actually very correlated?
I don't know. I haven't looked at that. Those two.
They actually seem very different to me, but I could be wrong. And there's a lot about preference diversity that's consensus-based, right? Because voting in the GA isn't actually as diverse as we like to pretend it is because we want to use that measure. But,
right. So I'll tell you what. I can actually check that right now.
well, you don't have to, but that's nice.
If I can find it. And okay. Wait, I think I can. There it is. Okay. Huh. Yeah. Variance in the polity score is negatively correlated with that minimum S score, but it's only like negative 0.3.
Yeah, not very much.
So it might be worth looking at, right? So in an early version, I said that was preference diversity, and it does lead to coalitions to kind of blast apart pretty quickly. But I had a reviewer say, "Oh, this is invalid. You can't use it." And so I thought, "Well, okay." It's no longer there. But,
whatever you say, Mr. Reviewer.
Right. I mean, I love that variable, right? But I thought it made a lot of sense. So to the extent I can sneak it back in, maybe I'll give it a shot.
Are there any more thoughts about the paper? Scott, do you want to do anything to wrap up?
Oh, goodness. Well, first off, I do want to thank everybody for the comments. These are, I mean, I took 4 pages of notes, so I'll call that a victory any day of the week. This was really good. I've got a lot to think about. There was also some things I was worried about that I'm reassured about. So a good mix of things to do and things to feel good about. I won't complain. I should also thank Julie Phillips, my RA, who was responsible for some of this, the Napoleonic Wars data, and deserves a mention.
That's a little like an Oscar speech here.
If that's the hook, then I'm done. So.
Yeah. No. You can take all the Oscar time you want. You want to thank your mom, too?
He's not read this, so.
Okay. Well, thank you to Julie, and thank you to Scott, and thank you so much to our discussants who took the time to read the paper and to talk to us today. This will be posted on YouTube right afterwards, so that people can watch it long into the future, over and over again if they would like. And a reminder, in case anybody came on a little bit late, that we started with a presentation from Scott today, so you could go back and listen to the presentation, and you can also go to the Peace Science website to download and read the paper, and also to see what's coming next. So our next presentation is in 2 weeks, March 25th, and Sarah Polo is going to present some work on terrorism for us. So thank you to everybody, and we will see you next time.
Yeah, thanks again.